Okay, so, oh my word, I always make a little apology at the beginning of each of my recordings, which is itself an embarrassing on top of embarrassment. But uh, I don't run off a script, and obviously the quality of the substance and the contents of what I'm about to put forward would probably be a lot better if I did try to create an essay first. But anyway, I do think that there will be at least many threads and many themes that do actually sit together for somebody else to perhaps think on a bit and synthesize into a better. Uh, I do like to think that I produce some intellectual ingredient that other people can take as inspiration. Okay, so I think the title of this recording is going to be something like "John Maytham is a racist," or which is a bit of a clickbaity kind of title, but one of the because I almost don't want to prove that John Maytham is a racist. I actually want to prove a more broad and perhaps damning claim, which is that John Maytham is an evil person, or is a morally reprehensible person, who is essentially fueled by a kind of uh, or a psychological kind of impetus, which is what I want to explore, and I want to connect that kind of psychological bad faith worldview to what is generally what we suffer from in um, our public discourse and our journalistic commentary on things, which I want to link to an article which I read recently by Stephen Grootes. Um, the article, which I'm actually pleased to see, is getting a lot of blowback in the comment section on the Daily Maverick. I can't comment on the Daily Maverick because I won't support the Daily Maverick. You have to be a paid subscriber to be able to comment on it, and I don't believe in um, supporting gutter trash that goes to funding anti-constitutional propaganda artists and overt racial consciousness advocates. So, sometimes the Daily Maverick will have anti-woke journalists on its platform as well, but they are a common platform and they try to have people from both sides, and we have Stephen Grootes, who, in my view, has sort of created in his own outlook and political analysis a kind of mediocre, homogenized, um, sort of lukewarm uh, uh, compromise, which, quite frankly, is exactly he's falling into the fascistic booby trap, if I can put it like that. So his article is called which is on the AfriForum court case, is called "Song Will Tear Us Apart Again, Just the Way Malema and AfriForum Want." And just as that title implies, he is making a kind of moral equivalence between the EFF and AfriForum, which is quite frankly, it's astounding. It really is astounding. And anyway, but let me not jump too far here. Let me talk about John Maytham. So, you know, John Maytham's own position on identity politics has slightly evolved. I don't think that this is morally or ethically meaningful or significant in any way. All this proves is that the flip flopping of John Maytham means that he is sensitive to which way the zeitgeist, the winds of culture are blowing. He will change course depending on the prevailing or and it is probably difficult for him because these fashionable winds are almost at a loggerheads, so he has to kind of feign a kind of agnosticism, I guess, which is intellectually a bit difficult for him to do, or if he can't find good excuses to sort of tread water on the fence, to mix some metaphors together. But 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 it's interesting that I do think that this elevates the whole kind of moral discourse into almost a psychological dimension, because what is actually on display here is a kind of juvenile um, sort of popularity contest. It's almost as if, this is someone who wanted higher status in high school and was going to get it after high school, or in their kind of societal um, social commentary and intellectualism about you know uh, having opinions which other people should cotton on to. And so, people who end up using arguments which have a broad appeal, or which people can have a kind of built-in pseudo intellectual appetite for digesting and assimilating. And people who want to be influencers like this, who want to be social commentators, they'll often get into a kind of grift that is based on sympathy. And this is why I think identity politics is so enlivening to so many people, because it represents a kind of a cornered audience and a cornered market. Because you can kind of ply your moral arguments and your pontificating and your sanctimony um, in such a way that everyone who has a kind of vulnerable narcissistic component in their personality, which is most people, because most people um, are at least afraid enough to conform with the arguments of conventional expectations, and playing a game of sort of cultural diplomacy. And that is all based on sympathy and working out what sympathies must be ceded to, or must be respected. And we do have a kind of a very toxic cultural hegemon of respect for moral consideration, which is abstractly contended and vested in identity. But this formulaic model of an external value, or a kind of a cultural norm, which is based in a kind of a narrative which everyone can very easily contemplate in their mind or conceptualize. It just requires you to kind of give moral credence to categories like race and group identity. So, like, because people already generally have those categories in their head already, but non-racialism, was meant to sort of allow us to not actually use those against one another in policy consideration and in what would generally be considered democratic accountability or democratic literacy, um, because we've kind of broken that seal. We've got a whole slew of very toxic political arguments, which are quite frankly anti-constitutional overtly. And also, this is also paved over by the fact that so many academics and credentialed people have essentially cottoned onto this moral bandwagon, and they don't care that it's anti-constitutional, and they have abused academic freedom in order to continue this grift. You can see this quite clearly in the trial, the Afroforum trial against Julius Malema and the EFF leadership, which is why I think it's an important trial. It's not going to be digested properly because we've only got an insipid class of journalists who are so morally pathetic and so morally degenerate because of this radicalization of identity politics. Um, which I also want to link this, because I actually wanted to make this recording generally about John Maytham's treatment of the COVID stuff. I do want to bring that up because I think that's a nice separate example of all of these themes in action, where you can actually see how stupid this new cultural mentality is. Um, you know, COVID policy today is really the residue of all the political elites' necessity to save face and to, in some sense, not undermine their illiberal policy that overstepped the mark and which was essentially unjustified, but it was only substantiated under the ostensible legitimating factor that it was a decent precaution. It was a wise precaution to take at the time. Everybody else was doing it, so it seemed like conventional wisdom at the time, enough to just kind of blindly lean into it. But all of this kind of the idea that 70% of the population have actually already gotten this thing because it's a respiratory disease, and you can't really confine respiratory diseases. You can maybe try to change when it's going to spread, but it is going to spread. It is going to get through the whole population, which it essentially has done so, which we could have managed much better, if we had done the Great Barrington Declaration public health policy rather than the lockdown policy, which I think that if we look at those, if we contrast those two public health strategies, I think that it's not hard to fathom that it would have been much better for public health, which also includes many more things than just trying to obscure the vector of damage coming from one category, but also all these other categories. But the idea that we had no idea how deadly the virus was, you know, while we still have lockdown in some form or restrictions in some form, um, a year after we did actually know a lot more, and how sort of ignorance was feigned to just continue to double down in policies that still remained unproperly substantiated. And very early on in the lockdown, John Maytham had an expert from the University of Cape Town on his radio talk show program, and right at the end of the interview, he said, "Well, actually, we should maybe turn down the lockdown because we're not at full hospital capacity, and so we should." This was uh, before the vaccine was available, and in some sense, I think it did make good public health sense to assume that no vaccine would be made available, because also the utility of a vaccine for a COVID virus, which is a virus which mutates very quickly, I think is quite dubious. The prospects of having a useful vaccine, I think it's much more likely that the vaccine will actually force more radical mutation because of the selective pressure that a vaccine will bring to the evolutionary pressure that will be brought to bear on the virus after a vaccine is produced. But especially when we learned that the vaccine doesn't actually really stop the spread of the virus. Maybe it inhibits it to some degree, but it doesn't stop the spread, which means that this virus was always going to become endemic. It was never going to be eradicated. So anyway, I mean, there's so many like logical inconsistencies with the whole official narrative, and sort of continuing to want to validate or legitimize the the quite damaging and also the quite inappropriate public health policy that the world did take, or obviously the world didn't all do the same thing, but roughly that most countries and that most mainstream media outlets kind of ran with this fear mongering and this I think the reason why they ran with this fear mongering was because they couldn't hope to challenge the narrative, even if they wanted to. I think a lot of them didn't even want to, but I think a lot of them knew that the kind of resistance that they would come up against if they tried to shatter the narrative or challenge the narrative or confront it with alternative epidemiologists that had this great Barrington Declaration public policy, like they couldn't really give proper light on that alternative argument, because they had been radicalized by identity politics. Because it's the same kind of thing. It's a systemic oppression, and essentially we have to be sympathetic to the vulnerable, even though we're making the vulnerable section of the population, we're making their life worse, and we're also extending danger, because instead of everybody else getting herd immunity, we're going to say, well, no, we're going to try to stop the virus from spreading. We're going to make the virus spread as slowly as possible, and therefore we're going to actually keep the incubation period of this virus sort of extended and diluted, which is much more dangerous, because if everyone gains herd immunity quickly, then you can actually reduce. Because anyway, there are elements of this, but what you really don't want is, you don't want immunocompromised people being infected with a virus that already has an ability to mutate severely, because when it gets into those types of people, then it can really radically change itself. And so if you're going to increase just normal healthy people, if you're going to increase the time that they will contain the virus as a reservoir, you're going to end up increasing the duration in which the vulnerable, immunocompromised section of the population is going to have contact with these people. So, we really did ourselves a disservice by deferring herd immunity into the future, or by delaying it as much as possible. And essentially, a vaccine, especially this so-called vaccine that we've got, which is, quite frankly, it doesn't produce sterilizing immunity. So quite frankly, I don't really see how it's that efficacious. I mean, also it's more like a preemptive. It's a pre-treatment. It's a preemptive treatment, and it has also come, generally speaking, I would say, at the cost of suppressing therapeutics, because the vaccine is not actually producing sterilizing immunity. It's just it's a pre-treatment before you get the virus. So it's going to help treat the virus after you get it. That's all it does. And no other kind of treatment is allowed to be developed, because if you actually come up with an alternative treatment, then the experimental license for the vaccine becomes much more dubious, because, obviously this thing is a bit experimental, and we don't know what the long-term effects will be. It's impossible to know what the long-term effects will be, and we can't even talk about that question openly because of the narrative, because of the so no one can intelligently actually answer and ask proper questions about this. And I do think that this is a kind of inheritance in the normalization of a liberalism that we've already gotten from identity politics. And our journalism class is spineless and cowardly, but worse, they are morally inept. Now, I think John Maytham really exemplifies this, because the interview that I'm talking about, right at the end of the interview, the expert says, "Oh, we should stop the lockdown because the hospitals are not at full capacity. So we should actually get people. We need to get as many people infected as possible so that we can actually work towards herd immunity." That's what he said right at the end of the interview, and John Maytham was almost flabbergasted, and he just kind of didn't even respond to that point directly, and he just sort of summarily ended the interview, because I guess he could sense the danger that, he didn't want to be the person heralding in the piece of information that cracks, sort of the mask of the illiberal edifice, good acolyte and zealot that he is. And so, when the facts don't support the moral sanctimonious narrative, and now essentially the only thing that we have left now is, and you can see this almost in Canada. I do think that they need to keep on doubling down in order to validate, because essentially if they receded in the way that they should recede, in terms of removing restrictions and removing mandates, that would almost be accepting certain facts that would disprove the legitimacy of the lockdown policies. It would actually undermine the logic of those policies. It would show those policies out to be essentially unjustified, or that they overstepped the mark incredibly, that they were not prudent. And so you can see that the reticence that we have now is really a kind of one hand washing the other hand. And that's quite disgusting. And the journalists still, can't actually do their actual job in a liberal democratic open society, because we don't really live in a liberal democratic open society, and it's predominantly because of these journalists. They don't have proper integrity. They don't have proper moral sensibility. They're too used to using character assassination against anyone who tries to confront their dishonest narrative peddling, which is all based on this kind of sympathy, systemic oppression, kind of siren call. But it's really them that needs to be character assassinated. They are really the racist and the evil people. But it's hard to get these kinds of values discussed, and it's hard to get these kinds of fundamentals discussed, because they've been so thoroughly betrayed and undermined and subverted by this class of academics and such, which now forces, it's weird, because I really thought Stephen Curtis had more sense, had more sort of fundamental grounding inside of himself. But he does have this sympathy. I wonder if it's, it's weird that journalists, in my view, seem to, they have this sympathy button inside of their head. And maybe it's also what encourages them to be journalists, because they want to be a part of this kind of sympathy fabric in the cultural milieu. That they want to be these kinds of these moral mediators, or mediators of the morality narrative. It's almost like these little lieutenants in the witch hunt. That's really how I see these people. But so yeah, I did want to weave this into the stuff about sympathy. I think I'm not going to recapitulate my whole thing about sympathy and psychology. It's all in the Habermas 4.5 hour recording, sadly, which is way too long. But yeah, you see, this is the problem with my content. It's not really decent enough or palpable enough to be digested. It's but yeah, I would just direct. The first hour of the Habermas recording that I made is very embarrassing. But I get into specifics about constitutionalism and about legal things and about the psychology of sympathy. Anyway, and it's interesting because, it is linked also to these gender sexual issues. Or a kind of ideology around gender, which is, anyway, I discuss feminism in that, but the interesting thing about feminism is that it really is all based on this kind of sympathy stuff, and it does end up enforcing a kind of a strange convention of moral autism or morality autism. And it does so by first sort of imposing a kind of gender autism, that people can self-identify their own gender, and therefore there's this kind of social construct which everyone in society should be goose marching in lockstep with. That there must be this regimented convention that everyone must accept, and so therefore once you got that you can impose an expectation that everybody must automatically respect everybody else's self-identification of gender, you've got this merging between the subconscious boundary and social expectation, which so you've got everything plugged into a kind of ideological narrative. And when you dissolve the individual in that kind of game playing, you've kind of got a bucket fishing of for vulnerable narcissists to extract sympathy from people. And so, I do think that, this has been normalized first by feminism. Excuse me. Been drinking too much milk. Um, and yeah, I mean, and essentially the deviation that feminism evolved, sort of in from non-sexism, like there's a world apart difference between non-sexism and so-called feminism. Um, and I mean, and this is a complicated and it's a messy thing to actually dissect and talk about, because you actually have to actually start looking at the differences between femininity and masculinity as archetypes or something like that, because obviously all of these things are generalizations and they don't hold true. But feminism is essentially a kind of politicization of the sexual marketplace and trying to, in my view, actually enforce quite a traditional feminine interface with the sexual marketplace and try to create a kind of political outlet of the same. They want masculine energy to be responsive to them in the same way that masculine energy is responsive to them in the sexual marketplace. And that's problematic because that traditional gender role bifurcation is is why women were excluded from leadership positions to begin with, because they just have expectations and they demand outcomes, and somebody else just has to kind of deliver it to them and do all that other work around actually working out the delivery process. And when you have that kind of bifurcation of work between the genders, um, it creates paradoxes. It creates, if you start saying women should be allowed to exploit politics and power and ideological narratives in the same way that the opportunistic feminine sexual strategy can exploit the sexual marketplace, and both there is a masculine exploitative sexual selection strategy and there's a feminine as exploited opportunistic sexual selection strategy, and they look different. They're inverse. They're quite different from one another because men and women have had different, let's say, inculcated instincts because they don't have the same burden in terms of biological reproduction. The selective pressures are different. Um, you know, so there are a whole lot of basic facts. Because where men and women are the most different is the sexual marketplace, essentially, and this is because their biology is different. So why would they be the same? Now, that doesn't. That's not a problem for non-sexism, but that's a problem for feminism, and you know, it's what happens when you have weird ideas about the notion of equality and you don't understand what normative ethics are, and you instead demand outcomes or whatever, like, so all of this stuff is bound up in this kind of stuff. And you know it's quite embarrassing to see academics who you know are addicted now to this kind of grifting of an aggregation of societal capital and societal power in terms of influencing cultural conventions and trying to lay down an orthodoxy which is quite frankly totalitarian. And our journalistic class is just falling into all the booby traps, uh, because it's contained, or the people contained therein. Or I mean, it's also the problem is the media houses themselves. The actual people who own the radio stations and the newspapers are, a lot of it is political money that is owning these things. Prime media, they're basically sort of surrogates for the ruling party, and so obviously there's some kind of internal politics that these people are playing, probably to keep their job or to sort of toe the line, to keep themselves employable, I guess. So we have a kind of captured. I mean, I wonder to what degree it's that we just lack independence within these institutions, and they have kind of lost all of their fundamental honesty or authenticity. But I mean, we can't also downplay the amount of psychological capture, because as soon as you get people who are, quite frankly, immature as individuals, because they are used to having their subconscious emotions merged with their worldview and the status of their worldview, and they have this kind of homogenized conflation where they are the role that they play in the world, or something like that. And so they play the game, their life, as a game in identity politics already. And so then when someone gives them an ideology which sort of reifies their narcissism, essentially, then uh, or at least their vulnerable narcissistic intellectualism. Um, anyway, look, I'm skipping over things, but I would just direct people to the Habermas recording if they're interested in this. But okay, let me talk about Stephen Grootes now. So it's a terrible article that he just basically said that Afroforum made Julius Malema famous in the first place by arguing against the song. And Julius Malema then became more prominent within the ANC. I mean, this is a complete rewriting of history. Julius Malema was going to cause trouble. Yes, I mean, it is part of the fascist game to create a conflagration. The idea that you're going to blame this, you're going to lay this at the ground of that Afroforum should have been more complacent and placid, uh, and content, you know, to not see that the EFF or Julius Malema as an individual within the ANC Youth League, that his whole strategy was to agitate and provoke. I mean, he was the one. I mean, people, I don't know, but he was the one who organized the destruction of all the toilets that weren't put in enclosures after the community had agreed that they could either have half as many toilets with enclosures, or they could have double the toilets and build their own enclosures. And as a community, they chose to have double the toilets provided to them, because there was only budget for so many toilets, and with enclosures included, given to people. And he destroyed these things. Instead of helping people build enclosures, he destroyed the toilets to make a political point, an anti-DA, I guess, political point. Now, within the ANC, this was considered a kind of lawlessness. Paulo Jordan got Julius Malema to actually leave an internal meeting within the Western Cape. He said, you can't do this. Paulo Jordan was, as far as I know, the only person to ever stand up to Julius Malema within the ANC, or at least the first person to do so. So, this was Julius Malema's plan all along. The point is not that, you're playing into the politics by actually noticing them. Is quite frankly, the only way to overcome fascism is by essentially making it illegal, and essentially it is illegal. It's unconstitutional, it's unlawful, it's anti-constitutional hate speech. But the courts have already fudge this line with racialist legislation, with black economic empowerment. So the courts have already kind of ceded the ground. So now we have to play in the fascistic playpen, um, where we've really normalized a level of racialistic consciousness through the auspices of the law itself. We're culturally in a very weak position, but our constitution actually does have a solution to the liberal intolerance paradox. It does actually have a way of diagnosing when people cross the line. It's just that that line has already been blurred, and now it continues to be blurred by Stephen Curtis. I guess maybe because, he doesn't know what line to take, because the Constitutional Court judges themselves are, have quite a lot of racial consciousness ideologues on the bench. We have anti-constitutional people in the judiciary. It's in the Constitutional Court itself. It's disgusting. So, I don't really know what the solution is to that problem. You could maybe some part of the country should maybe declare independence so that we can reinstitute constitutional supremacy. But, journalists obviously don't have the stomach for these kinds of stark arguments, because they have no moral backbone, and they just kind of chug along at, whatever the wind is blowing, and then they try to look reasonable and in the middle ground or something like that. Well, if you try to be in the middle ground of something that is overtly corrupt, well, you're just as wicked as the corrupt system that you're trying to essentially cheerlead for, or something like that, or carry on that wicked baton relay. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, so and then we've always got these academics, and so I guess Stephen Curtis is embarrassed when he sees someone from academia go on the stand and give it basically their cheerleading of racial consciousness and black fascism, um, and that just kind of shows how I think the Afroforum court case, at the very least, is going to be very important for history, because it's going to be evidence of the decrepit nature in which that we have devolved our democratic literacy, and also devolved our general standards, and how we've lost so much in the so-called democratic prerogative that was invented and imported from American jurisprudence in order to um, secure the betrayal of the limitations clause of our Constitution, because you can only limit a right in the Constitution relative to the limitations clause, and they didn't use the lettered subclauses in the limitations clause. They just said, no, 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 it just needs to be justifiable in a democracy. Never mind that in the limitations clause it says justified in an open liberal democracy. So they can just say, okay, well, everything is justified because of the democratic prerogative. If the government has majority representation, they can do whatever they want, even if it's inconsistent with the Constitution, because they have the prerogative to do so. So they have a very superficial reading of the Constitution, which has been completely reinterpreted. Social justice has been completely reinterpreted in an anti-constitutional way because of racial consciousness and solidarity with the black identity, which covers over everything. And so instead of Stephen Curtis actually getting into that kind of issue, which I guess is, maybe it's a bit esoteric, and maybe people don't want to do that, because then you have to kind of indict the Constitutional Court itself, and you have to indict the general state of the law itself. But, that's too sophisticated for him. So instead, he tries to make a moral equivalence between Afroforum and the EFF. I mean, it's just patently preposterous. It's retarded. But not only is it retarded, it's I do think, well, it just shows you how far moral autism goes. Like once you get the ball rolling, you can just everyone just conforms. It just becomes a conventional expectation that everyone rolls into alignment with. It's utterly disgusting. I mean, this is how Weimar Germany devolved into fascism. Exactly how liberalism was discredited by the Nuremberg rallies, by all of these people, Nazis and communists, hand in hand, marching to to undermine libertarian philosophy, because they basically, it's when an electorate says, we don't want responsibility for our government, treat us like an identity, bestow us what our identity deserves, because we don't want to be in charge of politics, we don't want the respect and the dignity of an electorate, we instead want to be infantilized, and we just want a mediator, a Führer, to paternalize us. And I think that is what Stephen Krut is indirectly being a apologist for. He's trying to have the system be saved. In some sense, he has already been corrupted or cottoned on to the Führer principle. He already thinks that is the solution to this problem, is that we need a savior in some sense, because he's not even doing his proper function of actually promoting democratic literacy and informing the public of the issues involved. He is creating a very shortcut, mediocre analysis just to try to massage things into some kind of stable fudge that then somebody else will inherit the problem of and will sort out. It's a weird kind of doubling down sort of thing. Expecting that there should be a resolution, there should be a middle ground to this kind of bullshit, when no one has the temerity, has the backbone to actually put a view on it and shed a light on it. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, another day in a gangster's paradise. What do they say? Where dignity gets, or reverence gets ceded to over totalitarians and fascists. I mean, the idea that Afroforum is a radical pole in our politics. I mean, if anything, it's as if what Afroforum is like in Weimar Germany. Imagine if a bunch of Jews got together and tried to create a political answer to the Nazi party, and then everyone was saying, oh, stop trying to stick up for yourselves, stop trying to protect yourselves against this toxic rhetoric, you're just empowering the Nazis, everyone thinks that they're a clown anyway. Stop taking the bait, you're reinforcing each other, like it's like saying, cry us a river, why don't you make a political project after you start, other, once they've taken power in politics. Don't just complain before they've taken power. It's quite frankly, it is that kind of. I think that's a perfect historical comparison to make, although it's slightly counterfactual. Um, Now, look, I mean, I agree that. Anyway, I mean, I've got other recordings on my YouTube channel which kind of make that kind of point a bit more nuanced as well. In terms of, because I mean, I do think that there is a kind of Jewish identity politics, which occurred because of the Holocaust, essentially, and that has been a strange proto-identity politics, which I think might have also influenced things like feminism and this kind of black consciousness movement as well. So it is also complicated, because you can turn victimhood into a kind of like a historical resource, and if you keep on sort of leveraging that historical resource, it's well, I mean, it's just another It's the same formula of identity politics, just with slightly different window dressing, essentially. Um, which, maybe as long as it's only used when, you see, I guess, the problem is that if you try to use it as a cudgel or as an argument, when anything that you can hypothetically imagine to be anti-Semitic is being expressed. You see, I mean, this is the problem: is when you label someone as being anti your identity, it's a nebulous moral claim, unless they are actually intending to be anti your identity, unless their intention is actually genocidal. So there's a difference between someone who actually is anti your identity and someone who is ideologically, narratively, constructively anti you, according to your ideological reductionism or your sociological reductionism. So you can't just say, well, the effect of what your opinion is that you are anti my identity. That is not a claim that should be respected. That's a claim that has all of its substantiation still to do, because tell me why that's a morally valid construct. And there are all these disgusting presumptions that are usually built into those sorts of claims. Which is essentially some kind of identity essentialism or some kind of it usually comes in the form of demanding some kind of equality of outcome, and it hasn't even bothered to try to correct things through a process that actually has moral rigor. They don't care about process. They want to hopscotch over moral processes and ethical processes and common standards and a common vision of justice. And they want to get right into the shortcut and the expedience and the convenience of, kind of redistribution and group guilt and other kinds of disgusting, dehumanized things, which end up not even being transformative, because whenever you treat people as a recipient of token representation, they don't receive it as an individual. They only receive it on behalf of their identity faction or on behalf of their group. And because then they can't actually be empowered as an individual, it's psychologically unsatisfying, which means that the only thing that will make it psychologically satisfying is if they prize the hurt that they cause by displacing or supplanting the thing that it's redistributed from. So it becomes a parasitic form of exploitation or extraction. And that is really the totalitarian, or the kind of the totalitarianism of sympathy extraction from systems. And this is why the left doesn't look fascistic until it actually starts implementing things and doing things. That the left seems very sympathetic and very inviting and nice, and it has all of these nice sounding values and ideals of egalitarianism, but that egalitarianism doesn't actually have compassion for individuals. In some sense, it has compassion for your own fears that you kind of hypothetically extrapolate onto other people, and so you have a kind of sympathetic bond with other people, because if you were in that position, you would want this handed to you. And so it really is all about sort of duplicating your own imagination of what you fear onto other people and having sympathy with that, which is not the same thing as compassion. And so, they don't actually care about the human condition, and they don't actually care about other people or know about other people. They're not really, they've never tried to rehabilitate somebody else, and so the responsibility and accountability and individual boundaries have all been blurred into this narrative, this quite autistic kind of narrative, based on this kind of cult of sympathy. And then the thing is that doesn't look paradoxical until you actually have to make a policy, until you actually have, when the rubber meets the road and you actually have to come up with the socialistic agenda when you have to come up with a concrete way of actually doing something, then you either continue to be socialist, in which case you have to everyone has to burden the dishonesty of the system, because the system will be ad hoc in some way. It will have to cut corners because it's going to have to trample on people's libertarian nature of responsibility, and they're going to have to believe the narrative in order to ha- be regimented in a kind of conformity. And the only way to do that is to have a scapegoat. So you see that in the USSR, class consciousness, even though within the USSR everyone is living in the same system, everyone had to believe in class consciousness, because you had to have a collective scapegoat in order to keep everyone regimented and coordinating with each other according to the system. And that essentially, when the system looks unintelligent or looks ad hoc, then you have the same enemy to blame, because you're all fighting the enemy constructively while you are being regimented and kept in alignment. Whereas the fascist also has to do that, but they're kind of more honest about that. The fascists can enjoy more of a mythological or mystifying kind of cell group. This is so, and they can also be more imaginative about their boogeyman, about their scapegoat. And so, it's almost like a performance. It's almost like a kind of surrealist, collective form of art, because essentially the boundary of their insect society, because fascism, just like socialism, ends up, you have to create a kind of collective mentality and a collective ethos. And so why not turn it into, like a blood and soil drama? Why not really elaborate it into something, that's almost religious in its kind of occult mysticism, or something, make it really mystifying and mesmerizing for its inhabitants. It's kind of like Soma in Brave New World. So Brave New World is really more the socialistic kind of optimization. But I'm just saying that, like, obviously fascism is cynical about what it is that it's doing to its own people, and therefore it manhandles that part of it. It doesn't try to systematize it or make it intellectually coherent. It's okay if it's unique in some sense. It's okay if they color outside the lines, because the lines are a means to an end, and the end is just a kind of is itself paradoxical, which is what the Führer is meant to embody. It's meant to embody the parenting of that paradox, because they are both of the system, but they are meant to be above the system. So they have almost this kind of collective redemption ability. I mean, they are actually, it's kind of like it is similar to creating a kind of state church, um, which the socialists are also trying to create a state church, but more ideologically, so that everyone can actually understand it. Everyone has equal rational access to the state church, whereas the Nazi fascistic state church actually has more functionaries and ritual um, office holders to make it more. Anyway, I mean, they're both. The reason why I go into this kind of detail is because, we have the proto-acolytes of these worldviews, and they're our journalists and our academics. That's who they are, and they all need to be got. We need to revive these institutions. We need to clear them out. We need to stop. You should not be able to get a salary coming from public money while undermining constitutional supremacy and fundamental constitutional values. You can't abuse academic freedom like that with supposedly, sociology is used to justify everything now. Sociological statistics, which, it has become a field that has absolutely no moral bearings, and it has just adopted the narrative of racial consciousness and racial ideology, um, and then it just produces and manufactures everything. All its research is a fabrication that promulgates conclusions that they have already that they've begun with. Which is this cult of representation. Anyway, and we don't yet have a cultural impetus to clear these things out, um, which is, I mean, we do need something like a McCarthyist Red Scare, um, but on a kind of constitutional moral revolution of, we do need to create a parallel set of institutions so that we can sort of gatekeep them and keep these toxic people out. That are actually also within these institutions, that they're not just gatekept, but they have kind of they have principles and they have values which are, let's say, mean something. And so, you can't get people that infiltrate these things that are like sleepers and then they start changing their politics and then they have tenure. No, like you actually have to have institutional integrity and fidelity that is strong enough that can actually spit people out when they cross the line. And this just requires, sort of understanding non-racialism at a very, and non-sexism at a very deep level, so that you can actually be, let's say, mature enough to actually know what is crossing the line and what isn't crossing the line. Okay. And not be gaslighted by, the superficial moral narratives of people. Anyway. Oh, this has been embarrassing. There was a thing that also was, I don't listen to 567 medium wave very often anymore. I don't listen to that radio station because I can't take the illiberal propaganda and the gaslighting and the narrative witchcraft, um, and the flip flopping all the time and the moral decrepit, um, you know, the kind of the moral relativism that they constantly broadcast. Essentially, I hate this kind of middle ground stuff. To me, it's quite clear. You have to be quite stridently anti-woke, otherwise you are sort of by default going to be a kind of vulnerable narcissist zombie peddling some sympathy, sort of uh, franchise, or as part of this great sort of mafia racket that's going on in the culture. But what John Maytham was doing was he was creating quite a false polemic around Rob Malone. He was saying Rob Malone uh, has one decent point that he makes, and he's overplaying his hand, and he keeps on repeating this point, and he's on all of these uh, Steve Bannon interview shows. Like, he's trying to sort of uh, paint Rob Malone, of, that, his claim to fame is that he basically invented the RMNA vaccine technology. And so when he talks out against it, maybe people would give it some credence or they would listen to it, but that they shouldn't listen to Rob Malone because he only makes this one facile point. So he basically, John Maytham strawmanned Rob Malone by reducing him to making one stupid point, and then he forgets all the other things that Rob Malone says. He just kind of conflates them into this one point. And you can see what John Maytham is trying to do here. He's trying to basically say that these people, they have one half argument, and that's the only thing they have going for them. But that is actually the beginning of the rationalization. That's the beginning of the rationale. That he's basically trying to create a kind of an echo chamber so that people in his echo chamber will be immunized against the counter narrative. Because if they hear, oh, Rob Malone is saying this, they can just kind of automatically dismiss Rob Malone's point because they dismiss his first claim because John Maytham has debunked it, has dunked on Rob Malone. And it's disgusting, it's dishonest. He deals with a straw man and he paints it as a guilt by association. Oh, Rob Malone is being interviewed by other people who would interview Steve Bannon or on these kind of Steve Bannon shows, so he just kind of says, oh, okay, they're all, he's being politically supported by all these people who are deplorables, essentially. That's the crux of John Maytham's argument. And yeah, I think that kind of cherry picked narrative contortionism, uh, he doesn't. I mean, that to me is a kind of propaganda. Uh, he doesn't even try to represent the argument that Rob Malone sets up. But he very cleverly kind of outmaneuvers it by this radical recontextualization, so that his quite superficial argument of guilt by association can carry the day. And I mean, you see these kinds of maneuvers constantly being played, where people are sort of muddying the actual contention that should be investigated by journalism, these issues that should be painstakingly explored and researched and actually hear the debate. But instead, well, this is how academia has poisoned the waters, is that, you know, they say, well, I'm correct because of context. They never actually substantiate the context. They just repeat their whole narrative. They just table thump their conclusion and their worldview. They never actually defend it against the counterclaim. They just discredit the counterclaim and strawman it and reframe it and just repeat themselves ad nauseum. They don't actually engage in the actual contention. They don't confront the actual issue. They really frame it as a kind of character assassination, and that's exactly what John Maytham did. Is that he performed a character assassination on Rob Malone instead of actually dealing with the substance and the crux of his complaints. But I guess this is perhaps also because John Maytham is plugged into a whole echo chamber of this kind of preening pseudo intellectualism, where they're all sort of refining this very feeble and brittle sort of control of this kind of top down elite driven control of everything, um, by this kind of lowest common denominator sympathy exploitation that everyone must, I mean, it's quite sad. I saw recently on Fox News that Piers Morgan is going to be on Fox News, which I think is actually a problem, because Piers Morgan has the same psychological bug in him. He can't actually deal with actual argument. He can't actually deal with actual substantive argument. He goes for the cheap shot, and he champions the sympathy conventional extraction. Um, it's a very cheap button to push, and it has a kind of built-in audience. And I think that it doesn't have a home in Fox News, because Fox News, has lots of people are involved in Fox News, they disagree with each other. They have lots of different opinions and they disagree with each other. But the way in which Piers Morgan disagrees with people, I mean, it just so happens that Piers Morgan, that a broken clock is right twice a day, and that Piers Morgan uh, has now sort of been bitten by the hand that used to feed him, and he has, he it's it yeah it's hard, so look, I will say that Piers Morgan is he that there's a difference between having a naive kind of leftism sympathy grifting module in your intellectualism. There's a difference between being naively doing that and doing it in overt bad faith, because you know how the sausage is made. You know that it's essentially that it's a formula and that it's a trick and that you just keep on using the same trick. And that this whole sort of bad faith thing is a more complicated than just having bad faith or not having bad faith, because there are sort of their degrees. Because I do actually think that if you're old enough, you are going to be doing it in some kind of nescience, which is going to be a kind of reckless bad faith on some level. But you've just kind of reconciled yourself with that because you think that that's what intellectualism is, that's what political social commentary or thought leadership is in the public sphere. That's what it means. And so when people, and that I think also is kind of married to a kind of nihilism or a kind of cynicism around a kind of perpetual agnosticism, that if you don't believe that there is such a thing as the truth, or if that everything is relative, then it averages out or approximates into, well, then we just have this game to play in terms of keeping society and keeping sociological commentary and judgment, like it's part of how society keeps tabs on itself, so that you just kind of join in this kind of collective insectoid, kind of ethos or morality code or whatever. And so, because that is a kind of a mystical secular form of religion to be plugged into, because you can't actually connect with something really transcendent. You have to connect into the zeitgeist. That's the sort of the closest thing that you have. So the closest thing that you have to the spiritual world are kind of sociological themes and abstractions and conceptualizations. And so, they're kind of lost in that forest, and there's nothing to graduate and lift yourself out of that forest. There's no other realm, there's no other cosmic worldview, there's no other moral grounding, but to find yourself lost in that forest and then to try to make your way, sort of reifying these sociological constructs in the zeitgeist, which then you are contending with, and contending in. So it just becomes sort of the default commodity that you are dealing in. And so I think Piers Morgan is that, and so, he's a kind of nescient but naive cerebral histrionic, or he's a kind of unconscious cerebral histrionic. Some of my own jargon and terminology starts getting strained because, you know, although some of these things are structurally different, they all amount to the same thing. They all amount to a lack of character, a lack of integrity, a lack of wanting to bootstrap responsibility, and finding the need to do that on the individual level so that people can actually have an understanding that can be respected and that can contain dignity, and that we can actually have, a culture of individuals that can be respected and contain dignity, instead of representing sociological symbology or, some kind of sociological conceptualized mystical forest, which we're all plugged into. So it's the way of getting, it's how an agnostic or a atheist sort of gets around, let's say, the problem of, the brain in a vat problem, the Descartes, sort of demon problem. The way to get around that is that you just believe, well, we're all plugged into the same mystical forest, and there's nothing more other than the sociological mysticism of the zeitgeist. So let's just all try to deal with that, and we'll all forgive each other for dealing with these generalized fudgy constructs of, of just muddling all these things together and making these generalizations real, and making these abstract, sort of fast and loose sympathies, forgivable. And as soon as you kind of let that in, your coherence goes out the window, integrity goes out the window, responsibility gets loose and fuzzy. And then something has to shoulder that, something has to absorb that, and that's a scapegoat. So then you need to find someone to cast that shadow onto. And that'll be someone who doesn't buy your narrative, someone who doesn't buy your perspective of the mystical forest, and who isn't capable of actual negotiation and connecting with other people in a proper way, because their way presupposes or implies an external value, or relying on an external locus of control, or being just a kind of denizen of the mystical forest, or a child of the cosmos, or something like that. And so because you're always you conceptualize yourself in this kind of infantilized fatalism or determinism or some kind of cosmic narrative, then other people have to accept something like the same narrative. And so this is how the ideology of worldly dominion propagates itself, by hook or by crook, by going along to get along and forcing other people to go along and get along, and in the winds of the principalities of the air, leverage to corrode other people into submission, into some kind of worldly doctrine of sympathy dominion. So anyway, I'm not. I would say I've listened to quite a lot of Piers Morgan. I don't actually know if he says that he's religious or not. In some sense, I don't think it matters. A lot of people who profess, belief in religion, the, let me put it this point in the converse. This is why, people who dismiss Nietzsche, I really, who in my view misunderstand Nietzsche quite gravely. They don't understand anything about this whole story about the death of God. And let me just say that when let's say part of Nietzsche's fundamental philosophy and commentary on society that involves the story about the death of God, it never says which God is dead. When it says, when the guy proclaims that God is dead, it doesn't say which God. Is it the God of the world which is dead, or is it the God of the heaven and the earth? It doesn't, it's let's say it is implied that it is the Catholic God, or the or the so-called Christian God. But I would argue that the God of continental churches, or so-called Christianity or Christendom, the God of Christendom is not the true God. The God of Christendom is the spirit of man, is a false God. It is a sociologically engineered. Yes, it was. They tried to create a political dominion in the image of the true God, but they didn't do it with any proper temerity and fortitude. I don't see Thomas Aquinas structuring the political powers in Europe. I don't see him extending his reach of his theological understanding into law, and into creating a political thing that actually, so the peace between the state and the church, or at least the would, and I mean, Christianity has always had the sophisticated thing about it, because it in some sense it knows its limitation, but in as much as that it tried to create a stability, it was always going to be corrupt. And when that God dies, I think that that's not a bad thing, and it's also um, it just means that that incarnation of the political structure um, is no longer tenable because it's reached its apex, and which means that it's exhausted its own mystery, and now it's fundamentally in bad faith. It can't escape its own fundamental bad faith, and it has to rediscover the thing that was lost in the baby that was lost in the bathwater, as it were. Um, anyway, sorry, man, that's a bit of an esoteric way of framing all of this. Anyway, but anyway, I don't want to pontificate on forever, but and I'm mainly trying to sort of point at things in my other recordings. Anyway, so I mean, I just think that it's problematic because if institutions don't sort of gatekeep and protect their own brand, anyway, I think that Fox News might still be safe because essentially Fox News doesn't really have a brand other than that it is a platform that shows off the authenticity um, of its hosts, which are not expected to be in conformity, but they are expected to be in dialogue with one another. I do think that Piers Morgan is going to have an issue with dialogue. I don't think that he performs dialogue in a serious manner that actually conserves integrity. I think that he plays these kinds of dirty tricks. Um, and he's from a kind of a culture, an intellectual culture, where this kind of ploy is. It'll be interesting to see if he evolves at all, or if yeah. I think it's a bit of a toxic recipe because someone who's already that old, who he himself has slightly backtracked on some of the COVID stuff, but I can see him doubling down still on a lot of that uh, narrative bullshit. Uh, he's addicted to this kind of self consistency, and he's not serious about coherence. He's not serious about actually confronting the things that deflate his narrative. And he contends against that with a kind of character assassination as well. It's something that I mean, I guess I wonder if people can think that I'm a hypocrite because I'm always talking about assassinating other people's characters. But yeah, I mean, yes, I do think that. I mean, I guess I'm not worried about this because if anyone tries to character assassinate me, sort of go ahead. Um, because I do think that yeah, that's great. Let's all go down to zero, and then proceed from that. And because yeah, on some level, yes, you can character assassinate everyone down to zero, and then what do you have from there? Well, you have only your ability to create positive, constructive reasoning that is capable of negotiation, that is capable of collaboration, and all. Let's actually see what good reasoning can be put on the table and what we can then forge an agreement, a context of constructive purpose going forward. the only thing that I need to do that is the basic fundamental capacity of coherence and integrity, and you just need the capacity of those things. You don't need to have them as an identity. You need to just have them as a capacity that you can do, that you can operate actively, act upon and within. But and I do think that a lot of these people, they do have almost things like identitarian sentimental attachments, and so the only way that they can have those things is if they have a kind of skeptical glue that allows them to make rationalizations which then can go unchecked, and then they can use that to hold together their worldview, and then they're always avoiding going back to zero, because then they'll lose their attachments. It's very interesting how a lot of what I say could you could reframe this all in a kind of Jedi Force religion. Anyway, that's a different kind of thing. That's something which people, when they look at the Jedi religion, uh, it's very hard to understand the Jedi religion unless you basically combine it with something like the psychology of Christianity and understand the doctrine on a psychological internal level. Otherwise, it just looks strange from the outside. Detachment from emotion and all those sorts of things. Um, Allowing yourself to be used by the Force to to bring balance to it with its natural cycles in it. I listened to quite a good summary of. Maybe I'll try to post a link to it. I was trying. It was a bit of an obscure video. I think it was a video about purple lightsabers. No, I can't remember exactly. Anyway, this is vastly irrelevant.